So let's talk a little bit about affordability. And it's such a big topic, it probably needs hours and hours, but just briefly. There are some things in our zoning code, in our regulations, that are making it impossible to deliver workforce housing. And as an example, I don't think people realize how much the code is a culprit to why there's not affordable housing in town. And there's a cognitive dissonance because there's a frustration and angst with density, yet density, in many respects, is the reason why we can't have the affordability. So what do I mean by that? Let's take an example. Sans Serra. Everybody know the project Sans Serra, which is across from Nancy's Barbecue? It's a new 10-story high-rise. So Sans Serra is in the DTC zoning district, downtown core, which has a maximum limit of 50 units to the acre. Sounds like a lot, right? It's actually not. When you look at what 50 units to the acre is, it's actually a very low density for a core of a medium-sized city. So what happens? The financial team of a project, not the architect's fault, the financial team insists that the architect maximize the envelope that the zoning allows. So 10 stories, X amount of coverage, etc., etc. They insist upon it. That's why buildings are always basically in a high-growth area as large as the zoning allows. So they build the building, and then they divide that square footage into the greatest number of units allowed by the zoning. So if it's a 1 acre lot, or let's say it's a half-acre lot for argument's sake. Half acre times 50 units to the acre is 25 units. So 25 units in a 10-story building means that each floor is divided up into 2 gigantic apartments of 3,000 square feet each. And then the financial team, of course, insists that you sell it for at least the price of the construction. So you say 3,000 square foot unit times $400 a square foot leads to how much? $1.2 million. So if we were to stop fighting the density and actually allow the numbers to be set at a realistic economic level, it wouldn't immediately solve affordability. Of course it wouldn't. But you would actually there's developers that are lined up ready to build smaller units for working families, for starting out singles, for empty nesters wanting to downsize, and they can't do it because the zoning does not allow it. And so there's a whole list of 20 things, we could talk about it all night. But if you were to start removing those obstacles, you wouldn't increase the size of the buildings at all. You would just allow all of those high-rises to be divided up into smaller units.
How do you fix it, Andrew?
You need the microphone if you're going to have any input.
All I'm saying, how do you fix it?
How do you fix it?
How do you fix it? So, there are 2 documents that regulate growth in the city. Many people fixate upon the zoning code, but there's another document. It's called the Comprehensive Plan. The Comprehensive Plan has something in it called the FLUME, Future Land Use Map. And in the FLUME, there's blobs of color that have maximum densities. The Comprehensive Plan is like the U.S. Constitution. It's really hard to change. The zoning code is easier to change than the Comprehensive Plan, which is the Constitution. So we can't ignore the comp plan and the zoning code. So first we have to modify the future land use map to allow for uses and mixed use and a greater amount of maximum densities permitted on those areas, on those districts. And then we have to allow the zoning code to have zoning districts that have the numbers that match the comprehensive plan. So we have 2 major problems in both documents right now. And until you fix those 2 things, you can't even begin to address the affordability or attainability problem that we have in the city. So I don't mean to be a doomsdayer because I like to fix problems, but I wanted to identify for you what I think are 2 obstacles.
One other thing I'd like to mention is that
Well, I'm sorry, I've got another question over here. Just a moment.
I'll get back to it, I promise.
the end of 10th Street, you got a bridge across.
Mr. Mendon,
North of the.
they're not being recorded, and I've got a question over here. You're going to have to wait a minute.
Thank you. Along the proposed project here is a seawall, and what is your position on living shoreline, living seawall, tourism, and mangrove awareness, and that sort of thing, just off the seawall?
I believe, and this is a personal belief, that an occasional hard edge is okay, but I think it should be the minority of the waterfront should be a hard edge or a bulkhead or seawall. And I'm all for the softer living coastline edge. So that can take on many configurations. It can be a true mangrove fringe. It can be a not very elegant solution is riprap, which is the boulders like this. And then other designers have really mimicked the original Florida ecosystem with emergent grasses that come up into a hardwood hammock. So there's many different ways that we can look to original Florida ecosystems at the water's edge and recreate that, so that once it's finished, whoever gets to design this, you would be fooled into thinking that this was not as Kathy described, which was a spoil peninsula created by dredging, but rather something that had always been here and was part of the ecology. So I think we should also, like you said, examine how much hard edge versus soft edge we want.
Andrew, this question may be outside your expertise, but maybe you want to get a stab.
I'll admit it that it is.
Okay. This is a pretty large set of acreage that we're going to be talking about. And I suspect that the cultural organization and the scientific organizations, the museums, and other civic assets that are interested in building on that property are attracted mightily by the cost of the land, which is for them zero. That's a question of value here. If these institutions were forced to go into the city proper to acquire property for their facilities, would they continue to have the appetite that they're showing now when the land cost is zero?
Perhaps not, but perhaps yes. I think that if we start to be a little bit more sophisticated in the way we look at urban land in Sarasota, we could perhaps have our cake and eat it too. What do I mean specifically? Here, I've noticed that there's a tendency to look at a piece of land and think of it as one thing or another. So this piece of land is going to become a grocery store, or this is going to become an opera house, or this is going to become whatever, apartment buildings. But great villages, towns, and cities don't operate that way. If you look at the way walkable, mature cities, how they design urban land, there's a strata of uses, often in the same building. So you may see a ground floor that has a cultural institution, upper floors have offices or apartments, and there's a vertical complexity that's completely absent from here. So I think that if we look at some of the urban land that's in the city, and we make incentives, or at least make the zoning so that you can actually have that sort of complexity in the building design, we could actually give some of that land for free and still have economic development around it to offset the cost. But I think that we're hindered by the mentality that these acres are for you and you own them. And that's how we've always thought about urban land in this town, and I think that that's something that we have to move beyond if we're going to tackle these challenges. But I do agree that if we don't start to think in that way, you're absolutely right that the removal of these lands as possible landing sites for those cultural institutions may threaten their reinvestment in the city. I think you're right about that. So.
I'd like to second my neighbor's idea of keeping the green space green. And the, what you've been mentioning about embedding these cultural institutions in other parts of the city. Because I think that green spaces, particularly waterfront green space, is one of the most important things that a city can offer. And if it's all full of parking, which probably is only going to be used at night anyway, which is going to be incredibly expensive to build if it's going to be burned up over and would probably flood in any case eventually because of sea level rise. And then the point of the accessibility to be able to get at these cultural institutions from all different directions instead of